So what is a central bank digital currency? Well, put simply, it's a digital payment token which is issued and fully backed by a central bank. Oh yeah, it's also considered legal tender, and that payment system typically uses a blockchain. What's astonishing is that around 70% of all the central banks in the world are currently conducting some form of research on CBDCs right now. Even the Fed is researching a hypothetical central bank digital currency. The truth is that many of these central banks are evaluating a plethora of different models. Take China's Digital Yuan, for example. That's seen as a competitor to the US dollar's use in global payment markets and an alternative to the SWIFT cross-border transaction system. Whereas Sweden has been testing out their e-krona to reduce the risk of the krona's position being weakened by alternative private currencies. Then you have Cambodia experimenting with CBDCs as a way to promote the use of its own currency over the dollar. Now, it would be slightly boring of me if I were to just reel off a long list of all the central banks looking into CBDCs, but I think you get the picture. Many central banks are damn interested in CBDCs. But that begs the question, why all the interest among the central bankers of the world? Well, in my humble opinion, there are three main reasons. The first is efficiency. By that, I mean increasing the efficiency of the payment system for a society. For example, we know that the current international payment system is based on a net settlement at the end of the day. However, today's blockchain technology allows us to have real-time gross settlement. So yes, there are major implicit cost savings that can come from that. Also, think about the ease of deploying monetary policy right now. Think about those COVID stimulus checks and the mind-boggling logistics of sending them out. Having a CBDC that the central bank controls would simply make it a heck of a lot easier, cheaper, and quicker to logistically deploy that helicopter money. The second reason I think the central banks are experimenting is financial inclusion. There are many situations, particularly in emerging markets, where the traditional system uses intermediaries like commercial banks. On many occasions, these fail to serve huge swathes of the population. This leaves a ton of people unbanked and with little or no access to financial services. What CBDCs allow for is the cutting out of those commercial banks, which brings with it the opportunity to include more people in the financial system. In these emerging markets, just consider that it could be more than a day's walk to get to an ATM to access cash. However, with CBDCs, that access to cash could be made instant by being accessible through a phone. That leads me on to the final reason why I think they're exploring it. This would be the need to create or protect a form of monetary sovereignty. A great example of this is the Marshall Islands, who, since becoming a democratic nation in 1979, have used the US dollar as money. The way the Marshallese see it, issuing their own currency is a way of declaring their own sovereignty, and that is one of the key motivators behind their CBDC, the Marshallese sovereign. Oh yes, let's not forget another salient threat to monetary sovereignty right now is the emergence of global stablecoins like Facebook's Libra. So, CBDCs can be viewed by some central banks as a way of mitigating that threat. That all brings me on to a very important question. Why are so many central banks looking at using blockchain for these new digital currencies? Well, what Bitcoin and the financial crash of 2008 made us think about was the nature of money and its various elements. That's things like it being used as a medium of exchange, a unit of measurement, and a store of value. What makes blockchain super appealing to use for any digital currency is that it represents a good balance between the privacy characteristics of cash and the security characteristics of deposits. That's something that central banks are seemingly valuing right now. So, now that you know the basics of CBDCs, I want to move on to examine the broad implications of a successful CBDC. So, let's dive right in. When we talk about the potential success of central bank digital currencies, we need to distinguish between the benefits for central banks and the benefits for the broader public. The truth is that these benefits vary wildly depending on what country we're talking about. In many developed countries, cash is easy to handle and it's easily accessible. However, in many emerging market countries, cash can be very difficult to get hold of. To get access to it, some people might need to travel very large distances to get to that ATM. Cash can also be dangerous to have too. Muggings are a thing, you know. All those problems are a thing of the past if CBDCs are successfully deployed. All that cash would now be digital and only require a phone to use. That means that CBDCs actually have an immediate convenience and security benefit for users. Another thing holding back digital payments in general, and digital currencies specifically, is adoption. One way to overcome that adoption problem is for governments to say, we officially endorse this new payment method. If a government said that, I'd imagine the payment channel would see vast amounts of adoption quickly. There are also a ton of things you can do with a digital currency that are simply impossible to do with cash or even with electronic legal tender. That's due to the decentralized nature of blockchain. This actually leads me on to the most important reason why blockchain tech could play such a pivotal role when it comes to CBDCs. It boils down to a question of ownership. A CBDC, like cash, notes, coins, and electronic legal tender, is on the liability side of the central bank. These are not an asset of the central bank. So that means these assets are a claim that someone has on that central bank. A bit like how you have a claim when you hold that crisp $100 bill. Think about it. If someone operates a central database, which is the ledger for an entire country's transactions, then the owner of that database actually becomes the owner of that national currency. The reason why is because they have the ability to change all the database entries. What this means is that CBDCs are actually an asset and not a liability. Now, most people would agree that to actually operate a successful CBDC in a way that is consistent with our current accounting practices and legal frameworks, you are basically forced to use a blockchain or some other decentralized system. When you set up a system like that, you get a lot of benefits for the core mandates of central banks. So, what are these mandates that central banks care about? Well, the first would be price stability. The second would be financial stability. And finally, in some countries, there will be mandates like employment. So, that begs the question, how can a CBDC help a country achieve price stability? Well, digital currencies allow you to include a much larger part of the economy when it comes to measures of economic activity. Currently, we have a large part of our economy that's continuously growing and is entirely digital. The problem is that value creation in the digital space is not easy to account for using traditional measures. That means a lot of the prices we see in the traditional economy do not reflect the prices seen in the digital economy. However, if we have a currency, a payment system, a medium of exchange that underpins this new digital economy, you can much better target that part of our economy. This is something that CBDCs can help with. Now, when it comes to financial stability, we saw in 2008 that one of the biggest issues was a lack of trust amongst financial intermediaries. So, why did that happen? Well, we had assets that were opaque and couldn't be publicly audited. The blockchain can help with all that by acting as a commitment device for transparent finance. This, in turn, could make the financial system more stable. What all that means is that if you just care about the same things that central banks care about, then you'll be better off using a CBDC. Yes, there may be a role for cash and electronic legal tender. However, as the digital economy continues to grow, it seems likely that the imperative to move to a CBDC will grow over time. The truth is that CBDCs might actually be our best hope for digital currencies to be widely adopted. Allow me to explain. There are many amazing crypto projects out there with great tech and great ideas. However, none have been exactly mass adopted yet. One of the key reasons why is probably because cryptocurrencies do not yet interface with the existing financial system. After all, the vast majority of people are not into crypto. That is why many people claim that for any digital currency to be widely adopted, it needs to be accepted by the current financial system. The easiest way of doing that is actually by issuing a CBDC from an official actor. As mentioned, the Marshall Islands are considering their own CBDC. However, it's not the standard fiat-type currency that they're issuing. What they're trying to do is to give this currency a backbone that makes it immune to manipulation by politicians. A pretty good call, if you ask me. Now, that being said, the CBDC of the Marshall Islands is pretty primitive. It grows the monetary stock of that currency at a constant 4% every year. So, while there may be some volatility, at least you know it won't be inflated away into oblivion. In order to make this trust really effective, the Marshall Islands CBDC has a unique identity behind it, which makes sure that a person using this currency is not on a sanctions list. That makes this new CBDC more acceptable to the current financial system, as they know that drug traffickers cannot use that currency. Yep, I know. It's almost as if these financial institutions have forgotten that chaps like Pablo Escobar were pretty big US dollar users. The point is, if those traditional financial actors accept your digital currency, then it's a whole lot easier to get adoption for it. With all that being said, it's not a matter that CBDCs have everything solved yet. There are a number of challenges they face, so let's take a look at some of these now, shall we? The first major problem I want to talk about is usability. By this, I'm not talking about whether people can use an app on their phone or recover their private keys. The more pressing challenge, particularly in countries in an emerging market context, is what happens if one of these people trying to transact doesn't have a smartphone. How can you make payments digital for people with just a bog standard phone? Now, you might be thinking, who doesn't have a smartphone? Well, in places like South Africa, for example, only 51% of the population has a smartphone, with 40% owning basic or feature phones. Now, these may seem like low levels of smartphone penetration. However, South Africa is actually one of the better countries when it comes to smartphone ownership rates. So, the key thing to take away from this is that the majority of people in the world don't own a smartphone. When it comes to rolling out CBDCs, that question of how you can provide simple payment channels for people with basic phones or even people without a phone is a serious challenge. However, it is a problem that kind of needs to be solved if CBDCs are to be mass adopted. The second big problem facing CBDCs is privacy. It is true that there are many privacy-preserving blockchains out there, like Monero or Zcash. However, there is a sort of privacy paradox. On one hand, central bankers quite like cash because it's privacy-preserving. That's useful for resilience against the state. On the other hand, there is regulation for larger payment amounts, and that involves things like KYC and AML. One way of marrying these two seemingly opposing views would be to have privacy for transactions below a certain threshold, with auditability for higher value transactions. Whether such technology can be implemented in a decentralized CBDC ledger is another question entirely. I now want to move on to the meat and potatoes of this video and share my thoughts on the future of CBDCs as well as their potential impact on crypto. Now, fair warning folks, you might want to buckle up for this one. Okay, so it's no secret that COVID is a massive problem, and that has led governments to essentially chuck the entire monetary system at solving the crisis. That's led to an environment where central banks no longer have access to the tools to help stimulate the economy. Interest rates are already at zero, and that means this tool is essentially useless. Then you have fiscal policy, which is the process of how the government spends its debt and tax income. The problem we have here is that the world's governments are racking up debt like there is no tomorrow. Soon, we will be in a situation where the income governments get from taxes isn't enough to cover even the interest of the national debt. A scary thought indeed. If that happens, then you have the option of moving to socialism, where you have 100% taxation to service that government debt. Or governments could accept that this debt will never be paid off and turn to financial innovation to solve the problem. Now, honestly folks, if 2008 has shown me anything, it's that the global financial elites quite like financial innovation. We can see that in the form of quantitative easing, which is the process of the central bank creating new money and borrowing it from large corporations via the bond market. All that was to basically stimulate the stock market. What was essentially happening was that central banks conjured up money out of thin air, gave that money to corporations, who then bought back their own stocks on the stock market. Naturally, that pumped the price of stocks. Yes, it is true that some of that newly created money was used to buy government bonds as well. Then you had the decision that banks were too big to fail, and that resulted in the bailouts, which recycled the financial system into another 10 plus years of growth. Back in 2008, our problem was that there was too much debt for consumers, corporations, and governments, and that was solved by giving everyone more debt. Now we have this crazy health crisis, where traditional Keynesian economics says that you save in good times and spend in bad. However, we have a situation where governments pre-2008 took on debt in the good times and have been accumulating even more debt ever since. Central banks are now faced with the problem that interest rate and fiscal policy tools have been broken, and that monetary policy is no longer effective. I mean, most people are now living from month to month and simply cannot take on any more debt. It doesn't really matter what happens to interest rates. The result of that lack of personal savings is that governments are being forced to support people who cannot work due to rolling lockdowns. So with all that in mind, what I think the central banks will do is replace debt-based money with debt-free money. That's a snazzy way of saying that you can take all the debt that people owe at a bank, allow that bank to go bust, but make it such that people do not lose their money. The way to make that work would be to create a digital dollar, and when a bank goes bust, you would swap people's money for that digital money on a one-for-one basis. Now, I know there are many people in crypto who love the idea of killing fiat to help crypto succeed. Here's the question. Do you really want that? That's your parents, grandparents, and most of the world bankrupt overnight. It's also probably a world that none of us want to live in. So, what can you do to prevent a crazy Mad Max situation from happening is to create a CBDC with a supply as big as the bank going bust. Once it goes under, I can then download an app created by the central bank and the money I had in the bank is there. So, the bank goes bust, the debt-based money disappears, and it's replaced by a new form of debt-free money that's created by the central bank. Pretty smart, huh? But here's the problem. It creates a situation where the central bank owns all the assets and everybody's money. So, which country do I think will make this move first? Well, I think it will be China. Most of you will know that China has been the greatest economic growth story we've heard about for decades. That growth was fueled by globalization and capitalism, all underpinned by an internal communist philosophy. Let's face it, the Chinese government literally controls everything within its borders, while benefiting from exports to the world. That meant that the Chinese were stacking dollars from these exports and then used those dollars to buy US treasuries and get a return. I can really see a world where there are CBDCs for every major currency. These central banks would then release technology and API keys to allow fintech companies to build their own versions of banks on a new money supply not backed by debt. The good news is that the economy would not need to create debt to create new money. That means you don't have the systemic risk of debt. So, with these CBDCs, you have taken out certain risks, but created new ones. The new risks created are that you have money in the same hands of the institutions that make the laws. What I fear is that CBDCs will be used as a tool by governments around the world to track every single thing that you do. And if they don't like it, they will simply connect it to your digital passport and switch off your money and your right to leave the country. This sort of system could also be used to force people to prove that they don't have the virus if you want to participate in the non-lockdown economy. Yes, there will be a COVID vaccine at some point. However, through this infrastructure, the powers that be could implement a policy whereby your passport doesn't work until you have had the vaccine. Another thing that I think is likely is for CBDCs to be used to automate tax collection. So, I'm afraid to say that I think these CBDCs will usher in the biggest attack on freedom and privacy that we have ever seen. So with all that in mind, what does Bitcoin do? Well, Bitcoin was essentially designed to give you control of your funds, the freedom to spend them globally, and a money supply that cannot change and is not influenced by politics. I honestly think that if this crazy world I've outlined comes to pass, then there will be massive demand for money that you can own, you can spend, and has predetermined monetary policy. Now, of course, because Bitcoin's supply cannot be increased, that means the only way for you to get some is to pay more for it. So, I think we're likely to shift to a world with two monetary systems. Super efficient CBDCs, which pose serious problems for your freedoms and privacy. An exit from that system using Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So yeah, I firmly believe that cryptos like Bitcoin will act as a counterweight to CBDCs in the not too distant future. Personally, I'm going to say no thank you to that CBDC, but I will keep hodling my Bitcoin to help protect myself against central bank overreach. And that is it, folks. My overview and thoughts of CBDCs.